How do we make heat? Well, heat is energy. Where do we make energy? We need fuel to make the energy.
There's no sugar.
There's no glucose around. What do we use? Welcome to Commune. My name is Jeff Krasno. Today we're exploring insulin resistance and stress, how they're connected and how they can impact your efforts to lose weight. Now, if you want to hear more on the topic of weight loss, or more specifically, fat loss and body recomposition, well, be sure to check out episode number 528 titled Beyond the Scale, Lose Fat, Gain Muscle with Max Lugavere and Jessie Anchospé, aka the Glucose Goddess, on the audio podcast and also here on our YouTube channel. First up is Benjamin Bikman, MD. Now, Dr. Bikman is a metabolic research scientist and author of the great book, Why We Get Sick. Now, in the first half of today's episode, we discuss insulin as a vital hormone, its role in metabolism, and some of the primary causes of insulin resistance that can lead to weight gain and the inability to lose weight. So without further delay, let's jump right in, and here's Dr. Bikman. I recently finished your book, which is just masterfully constructed, Why We Get Sick. And you point clearly to this hidden epidemic that sits upstream, if you will, from so many of our most common chronic diseases, and that, of course, is insulin resistance. And this is a condition that I had personally, but it's a condition that impacts so many people, which is why it's so important, and so many people don't know about. So maybe we could just start on the ground floor and talk about insulin just as a hormone and its primary role in the body.
Yeah, right. And in fact, that's a nice place to start, because I sometimes am concerned that I give the impression of insulin just being a villain, that it is this monolithic evil in the body. And that of course is not true. It is absolutely a hormone essential to life. And the absence of insulin is a death sentence over the matter of generally a few weeks. You know, in other words, an untreated type 1 diabetic will die. So insulin's thematic effect is to promote the growth of a cell. Which is, of course, we can see why that would be so important. We need cells to grow. But never-ending growth, of course, is cancer. So we need cells to know when to not grow, or when to stop growing, when to die. Insulin doesn't want to have any of those effects. It only wants growth. And so it becomes one of the many instruments in this orchestra of endocrinology, where you have some hormones, insulin being the most powerful, promoting growth, and you have other hormones, which are myriad, that are promoting, well, I don't want to say death, but promoting breakdown. And this is the balance of the word that we call metabolism. Metabolism is simply the balance between anabolic reactions, or anabolism, and the catabolic processes, so the building up of molecules or the breaking down of those molecules. Insulin is very, very firmly on the anabolic side, not only promoting growth, but also inhibiting breakdown. And one of the reasons it's important to appreciate insulin's effects is that it's one of the few hormones that affects every single cell of the body. And I mean that literally. It doesn't matter what the cell is. If you take it out and look at it, it will have little docks, a little receptor for insulin. In other words, a little doorway just designed for insulin to come and knock on to tell the cell to do something. Every single cell of the body will respond to insulin in some way. Thus, when we start to explore problems of insulin, we can begin to appreciate, as you alluded to, some of the incredible array of consequences. And it becomes not particularly surprising when we look at problems of the brain, or problems of the bones, or problems of the liver, or et cetera, that are impacted by insulin resistance.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you framed it in that way, that so many of these hormones, or chemical signals in the body work kind of on this teeter-totter, if you will. For example, glucagon, which I think needs a better PR agent, since insulin gets talked about a lot, but it's countervailing or counterposing molecule, which is more catabolic in nature, doesn't really get talked about. But like you said, I think what we're always striving for when we're when we're trying to instantiate health in our life is that delicate, sensitive balance between growth on one side, which is anabolic or insulin related, and then repair and restoration. But I think we would both agree that we live in a culture that sanctifies endless growth, right?
Yeah, well said.
So perhaps you can unwind a little bit what creates a resistance to this very molecule of insulin.
Right. So I'll remind everyone of what you'd mentioned, and I'll elaborate on that, which is that, why even talk about this? It's because this is the single most common health problem worldwide. Within the United States, we estimate that up to 88% of adults are insulin resistant. And
Wow.
as much as we think here in the U.S., we have a tendency, I consider it to be somewhat unfortunate, to think that the United States is the worst in everything, that, metabolically, we're the fattest, we're the sickest. And that's actually not even nearly true. When you look across the world, rates of obesity and insulin resistance are higher across all of the Middle East and even throughout most of Southeast Asia and Asia, in North Asia. These are problems that are considerably relevant worldwide, and certainly the Pacific Islands are way up there, well beyond the United States. Even within our own backyard, Mexico has higher rates than we do. So as bad as the problem is in the U.S., and it is even worse in many, many areas around the world. So insulin resistance being the most common problem, it behooves us to understand its origins. And there are what I consider to be three primary origins, each independent of the other. Now, just by way of clarity, when I use the word primary, I have my own particular definition there, because there are numerous noxious stimuli that will induce insulin resistance in various experimental models. And that's why when I invoke the word primary, I mean that these three causes, which I'll elaborate more on in a moment, they have been shown to cause insulin resistance in isolated cell cultures, when you start growing cells in a little petri dish. They've been shown to cause insulin resistance in laboratory rodents, a commonly used model in biomedical laboratories, and in humans, the pinnacle of all creation, but humans at the top. And these three primary causes will still induce insulin resistance in the human. And the three primary causes are, in no particular order, one is stress, one is inflammation, and one is too much insulin. And Jeff, if you'll allow me to hijack the conversation for just another moment, I'll elaborate on them just a bit. And when I say stress, that's not unlike inflammation. It's a term that it's a very loaded term culturally. There's a lot of awareness and interest in that term. And so I want to make sure we understand it correctly. And with stress, I mean the elevation of the prototypical stress hormones, and that is cortisol and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. These are the two stress hormones of the body. So when I teach my graduate students in endocrinology about the stress response, I teach it in the context. I frame it around those two hormones. And these two hormones have almost nothing in common. Cortisol and epinephrine are totally different types of hormones. They fall into different classes of hormones. They're produced from different cell types. They move through the bloodstream in different ways. They activate cells throughout the body in very, very different ways. The one thing they have in common is that they both want to increase blood glucose levels. And they do so very, very quickly. A little shot of adrenaline, blood glucose is going to climb. A shot of cortisol, blood glucose is going to climb. Well, that, of course, puts them at odds with the hormone insulin, one of whose primary jobs is to reduce blood glucose. Now, inflammation is another very, very loaded term, and it's one that I confess I sometimes roll my eyes at a little bit because I believe it's invoked too readily. People want to drop the word inflammation just too frequently and blame everything on inflammation. And of course, inflammation has a very necessary role. If it weren't for inflammation, we would die at the slightest sniffle. The immune system is utterly vital to our survival and even just our repair and recovery. When we are recovering from a workout, it's an inflammation process that's improving the strength and integrity of the muscle and the bones. It's using the same cells, the same processes that we would consider to be only relevant if we're fighting an infection. No, this is a skill set or a bag of tools that can be used in myriad ways, from fighting an infection to healing and recovering, or from even something like a workout or a scratch. So with inflammation, when the inflammatory proteins are elevated in the blood, and these are referred to as cytokines, then they promote insulin resistance at tissues. This was actually the work of my postdoctoral fellowship that I did with Duke Medical School many years ago. It was actually elaborating, or elucidating rather, on the specific pathway within the cell that when you have a cytokine come and bind to the cell, activating an immune pathway, which every cell has, oddly enough or unexpectedly, that will promote insulin resistance within the cell. And this is noticed as we have more and more people wearing continuous glucose monitors. I have mine from Levels right now. You got yours. Mm-hmm. As people wear more and more CGMs, they will notice when that their glycemic variability is really going haywire, and it will often predicate them starting to feel a little sick, a scratchy throat, a runny nose. And in fact, it can almost be used not only as an indicator, but even a predictor of the onset of an illness, a cold or a flu, let alone something more severe. So inflammation, again, totally independent of any other variable, is also capable of causing insulin resistance. Now, the third and final, and what I consider to be the most important, is chronically elevated insulin. This contributor takes a little bit of thinking in order to see the model or the way it interacts, because what ends up happening is the creation of a vicious cycle. And I do believe it's the most relevant because it is the one that not only can you really identify very, very well through blood tests, it's also very responsive to interventions. In other words, if we were meeting with someone, Jeff, and we sat down with the person and we say, well, your stress hormones are elevated, that's contributing to your insulin resistance. Well, the individual would say, well, how do I lower my stress hormones? And we would say, well, we don't really know because we're not sure why your stress hormones are high. It's a difficult knob to really grasp. It's a little slippery. The same goes with inflammation. If we noticed that someone had higher levels of C-reactive protein, and they would say, well, how do I lower my C-reactive protein? We would say, well, we don't really know what's causing it. Is it something you're breathing? Is it something you're eating? Is it an autoimmune disorder? We don't really know. In contrast to both of those, insulin, if it's elevated, and we can measure that easily, we know exactly what to do to lower it. And I won't get ahead of myself because that can be part of the later conversation. But too much insulin will promote insulin resistance. And this is reflective of a fundamental biological principle. Too much of something will promote a resistance to that something. And this is almost an eternal truth, whether it is sort of body, mind, or soul. If we are incessantly inundated with a noxious stimulus, we become resistant to that stimulus. And we need more and more and more of it in order to get the same response that we used to. And now when we view this through the lens of the modern diet, which worldwide, the average, the typical global diet consumes almost 70% of all of its calories from carbohydrates. And it's carbohydrates, not proteins, not fats, that spike insulin the most. In fact, by a wide margin. And so it's easy to see then, as we continue to lay this out, that you have the average individual globally who wakes up in the morning and eats a starchy, sugary breakfast. Their insulin levels have been coming down overnight, and they immediately ramp them up, easily boosting insulin levels by 10 times, easily. And then even in an insulin-sensitive person, it may take up to 3 hours for the insulin to come back down to normal. And if you're an insulin-resistant person, it can take 5 or 6 hours to come back to normal. But of course, long before then, the person is now having a mid-morning snack, which once again is something sugary and refined. And so before insulin even has a chance to start cresting, they've bumped it back up again. And then the same thing happens with a starchy lunch, an afternoon snack, and an evening, their dinner, and then an evening snack. And so the average person is spending every waking moment, and even several hours into their non-waking moments, in a state of elevated insulin. And too much insulin, whether it's isolated cells or rodents or humans, contributes and independently causes insulin resistance. And thus, having framed it that way, the solution starts to become obvious, although we complicate it with medications and things. But this is one of the drums that I beat the loudest. You've allowed me to beat one of them already, which is just emphasizing the importance of insulin resistance in the global conversation of non-communicable diseases. But it's also emphasizing the importance of scrutinizing what goes in our mouth and how frequently it's going in our mouth in order to understand where the insulin resistance is coming from. In other words, why has it become the most common, most prevalent metabolic problem or overall problem worldwide? It's because of how we eat.
What are some of the other chief contributors to insulin resistance, would you say?
Yeah. So now that we've discussed the primary causes, which each is independently capable of causing insulin resistance in every studied biomedical model, then we can highlight the secondary causes. And these can be things like seed oils, for example. I very much believe seed oils are relevant to this. They have been shown in cell culture studies to directly cause insulin resistance at, say, fat cells and other cells. The reason I don't consider it as a primary cause is simply because it hasn't been, really, like if you give a human, a load of a seed oil, you're not going to necessarily be promoting, chronic insulin resistance. Those studies are just lacking currently, and perhaps the data will catch up, and someday I will bump seed oils from a secondary cause to a primary cause. But there are other things like which still play into the primary causes, like too much caffeine, for example. Caffeine can cause insulin resistance in part because it activates stress hormones. And I don't mean to tell people never drink coffee, don't ever drink a Diet Coke or anything, but I do think it behooves the person to be mindful of the dose. So I do think that it's better to kind of scale it down a bit if you can. But I've found that people who struggle with controlling their glucose levels, even though they are very strict with a low-carb diet, if it's not their sleep, very often it's that they're drinking too much caffeine. And that as they start to dose their caffeine down, they find that their glycemic variability starts to quiet down as well.
As you can see or hear, there is a complex relationship between insulin resistance, and various health outcomes related to maintaining a healthy weight. Stress is definitely a factor, which is why you'll hear more about it in the next segment. And next up is, me. Should I go first person or third person here? Not sure. But talking about the role of stress in weight management and the protocols that I adopted to help me lose 60 pounds of mostly fat. So it is certainly connected to stress, but through the same mechanism. So stress, if you have like a endocrine response to stress, so something stressful happens in your life, your HPA axis, which is a primary endocrine axis in your body, then releases like glucocorticoids, cortisol, for example, from your adrenal glands. Mm-hmm. So your normal stress response would be to release cortisol. That is going to stimulate the liver to release glucose.
Got it.
And then insulin will follow. Okay. And that is a adaptive response as part of your sympathetic nervous system response. So if you were to encounter a stressful situation within nature, as we used to 10,000, 20,000 years ago, you would want exactly that response. You'd want stress, you'd want cortisol, you want glucose shooting out to your muscles because you need to run, you need to fight or flight, right? So that is a normal adaptive response. The problem is that we live within a time of chronic stress. So with many people, we have this HPA axis always stimulated. We have cortisol always being released. And then subsequently, then we have the release of glucose. And then, of course, in response to glucose, the pancreas is like, we need more insulin. And so we get into a state of chronic high insulin. It's called hyperinsulinemia. And
that can be just really stress related, not even if you have like a fantastic low glycemic diet, but you're chronically stressed, you could have. Can I tell my story?
Sure.
So, Jeff's been wearing this continuous glucose monitor now for a year and a half, which has been probably the most transformational gadget that you've put on, and the continuous glucose monitor monitors your glucose levels and tells you when you're spiking, whether you're low, whether you're high. This is how you found out that you were pre-diabetic. Shocking to both of us. And so then I finally slapped one on last winter, and I figured I was probably fine, but maybe I was tofu. So I put one on. I figured I would just do it for 2 to 4 weeks, unless, of course, I found out some sort of unpleasant numbers, and put it on. It took a day or two to kind of calibrate. First, it seemed like it was high, but you said, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It just takes a couple of days to kind of get used to your body, or your body to it. And then I was very regular, sort of in range, as I guess one would say. And I definitely noticed my diet maybe wasn't as good as I thought it was, because I for sure ate and drank things that spiked me in not the best ways, but it was clear that if I wanted to be healthier, I could, and that my baseline glucose levels, my fasting glucose levels, were solid. And then about 10 days in, and I was down at around 80, which I guess is a pretty solid resting glucose. And then I would go up to 140, 150 if I, had big two cupcakes or something. And that was it. And then I was monitoring it, but I wasn't really, it wasn't that interesting to me anymore. And then my dad had that huge, very major health crisis. And I was monitoring, but I wasn't really paying attention because I was so consumed with going up to visit him and, hospital, and it was very dramatic. And then I looked back on my glucose levels after, at that point, and I was up in like the 200s pretty much, but across the board all day long with a few little dips. And I was just like, that's incredible. I mean, we hear all the time that stress is the killer. It's this, we all sort of get it, but to actually see that was so it was so eye-opening. And okay, yeah, that's fine. It was a crisis point, and I have enough, I have enough metabolic fitness to withstand a couple weeks of like crazy spikes. But for people who are chronically stressed, or, whatever, there's so many ways to be stressed, environmentally stressed for your, situation. Obviously, I was like, well, that is just, it's so interesting to really look under the hood and see those numbers. And our daughter had a similar experience just in this last month. Summertime, low, went to school, first day at school, 200,
So let me give you the headline there. Stress management is weight management. And let me then now write the article in a relatively Newtonian way, because, we want to kind of show sort of how these things happen by analogy with billiard balls. I hit the cue ball, then the cue ball hits the 2 ball, that hits the 4 ball, that hits the 8 ball in the corner pocket. That's just the way humans generally explain things. So I'll try to explain it that way, but knowing that there's a lot of other factors happening everywhere all at once. So you get stressed, you release stress hormones release glucose. Glucose stimulates the release of insulin. Over time in the body, and this is just a general rule, that the excess of any one molecule will cause a resistance to itself. So over time, elevated levels of insulin will cause a resistance to insulin. So when cells are no longer sensitive to insulin and they're not taking glucose in for the production of energy, it is storing then that glucose as fat, as triglycerides generally in adipocytes, fat cells. So there you have your chain link fence of why stress causes weight gain. In terms of like some of the protocols that I specifically adopted on kind of my journey and how it relates to a lot of the things that we've been talking about, one of the key protocols was a 16/8 intermittent fasting protocol. Now, there are a lot of like philosophical reasons to fast and to, sort of
Suffer,
but also just stop craving so much. To really, I guess how I would frame it is to be able to delineate between biological needs and psychological desires.
Yeah, manage consumption artfully and to choose.
Yeah, and then if you can not crave or succumb to your cravings for food, can you, not succumb to your cravings for your phone or alcohol or codependency or gambling or whatever else. So there's a lot of other reasons. And there's obviously baked into all these spiritual traditions, and there's reasons, other physiological reasons around the creation of BDNF and autophagy, the recycling of cells, and all this kind of other stuff that is very, very interesting, around longevity. But as it pertains specifically to weight management and energy balance, obviously if you're only eating in an 8-hour window, if you've condensed all the consumption of your food between, let's say, 10 and 6, you are probably also restricting your calorie intake. Probably, but not necessarily. You can fast and eat 20 pints of ice cream in 2 hours and gain weight. But you're probably not doing that.
But even if, from my understanding, which is slim, but even if you ate the same number of calories in an 8-hour window as you spread out over a 12-hour window, you would use those calories differently, which is another difference in calories in, calories out.
Correct. So,
and explain why.
There's a couple. So in vivo mice studies, they've shown that the consumption of the same amount of calories over a 24-hour window will maintain weight, and the same consumption, the same amount of calories in an 8-hour window, you will lose weight.
Right, I remember that.
Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why that might be. And of course, despite sharing the best laid plans, we are not mice. But but if you kind of tease out some of the things that we just talked about, you might understand why like not eating for 16 hours is going to really help glucose management and insulin management. So you're less likely to store calories as fat. You're more likely to use them and burn them as energy and maintain your insulin sensitivity, if you're only eating within an 8-hour window instead of spreading out, all of your consumption across a 24-hour window. And of course, like this is set against the backdrop of a culture that like now eats pretty much all
24/7
day. So there is that time constriction component that seems to be powerful. There's also the calorie constriction component inside of that time restricted, thing that is also plays certainly a part of it. But again, for me, I think it really points to glucose homeostasis and insulin management. Certainly for me, that was key. As I was running pre-diabetic blood glucose levels at 125 milligrams per deciliter fasting. And then after I started to adopt this fasting protocol, 3 or 4 months later, I brought that down to, 85 or 90.
Yeah, it was fast. It was amazing. And that, I would say, is one of the most incredible things that, and we've talked about this before, is that your body can get so pretty messed up over a long period of time, decades, and you can turn things around pretty damn quick. And that's incredible.
Yeah, I think you've often used the metaphor of the polluted river, that if you just leave it alone, it will generally reverse itself unless it's gotten past the point of no return. And then
the tipping point is the dangerous part.
Yeah. And when, if you have, proliferative, cancer that has metastasized, can you turn that around? I mean, there's actually a whole conversation that we could have around the Warburg effect and fasting and cancer and metabolism, but we'll save that for another time. So I think fasting and weight management and energy balance, that's certainly like a very, very potent technique.
Talk a little bit about hot and cold therapy, just because observing your personal protocol, it certainly has been pretty intrinsic to your.
So I think it's the interesting stacking of various protocols that can create like very, very powerful knock-on impacts. So in addition to that 16-8 protocol, I began to adopt a deliberate cold water therapy that is mostly about cold showers, just because we don't have a cold plunge here, but sometimes in Topanga when we have a cold plunge, I'll do that. And I've typically just absolutely hated the cold.
Even more than me.
Yeah, well, way more. And, but again, this is why I think it's important to have these conversations, even though they get a little bit geeky and scientific at times. But if you understand the underlying miraculous mechanisms of your organism, if you understand some of these concepts, it is so much easier to adopt the protocols because you actually understand what's going on, and you can start to experiment and tweak without just being paralyzed and just say, I don't know, just tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. I get it. People just they don't have the time to break all this stuff apart necessarily. They just want to be told what to do. Fine. But when you understand some basic concepts around metabolism, you will understand why cold water therapy might be so effective right before you break your fast.
All right, so give it to me.
Okay, so you fasted for 15 hours and 50 minutes. Before you take that first bite of food, what's going on in your body? At this point, you have very low blood glucose, right? So you get into the cold shower.
Brr.
Your core body temperature plummets from 98.6. It goes down a few degrees. Your internal thermostat sits right up here. Says, oh my God, we've got to get you back up into the Goldilocks zone around 98.6. How are we going to do that? We need to make heat. Process of thermogenesis. How do we make heat? Well, heat is energy. Where do we make energy? We need fuel to make the energy.
There's no sugar.
There's no glucose around. What do we use? Fat.
Yummy, yummy fat.
We oxidize fat. We break down triglycerides into free fatty acids, just like I said, and we use that fat in this process called thermogenesis to reheat our bodies. And that is happening highly effectively in this one form of tissue known as brown fat. So like brown fat is like the good, happy fat. It's brown because it has a high concentration of mitochondria in it. Mitochondria are brown, I think, because there's an enzyme in there that requires iron in there. Yeah. And these are very metabolically active cells that are largely responsible for thermogenesis. And they will actually beige your mean, caustic white fat. They will make your white fat brown. And so
if you get yourself cold regularly, that's
yeah.
what turns your white fat brown or beige.
Yeah, it's one of the techniques that will do that. And so, right, so you're just think about it. You're fasted, low blood glucose, you get cold, your body needs to make you warm, you need a fuel source, there's no glucose, you burn fat.
That's another way that the calories in, calories out is broken apart, because I mean we're all talking calories out, but it's a way that calories out is configured totally differently than, running for 50 minutes on the treadmill.
Yeah. So that protocol right there of fasting and before I break my fast, take a cold shower, that was a massive accelerator for weight loss and the oxidation of fat for me. It was huge.
And just metabolic function, I think even more important, because I like coming back to where we started, I think the more interesting and amazing piece of your health journey is not so much that you physically look more fit, which is great, and I like to have you on my arm more now, but you really are so much healthier, and that's a whole system thing, and that's where what you've done now is so different than like when you turned 40, you stopped drinking and you stopped eating bread and you lost a bunch of weight. But it was just a weight thing. It wasn't a metabolic health thing. And that is the game changer. And what I had no understanding really of how metabolic health is related, but so different than weight management.
Yeah. Well, it's an upstream from all the major killers, all the major chronic diseases, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's. Upstream from all of those diseases is metabolic health or metabolic dysfunction. The last, I think, little piece here relates to muscle development, muscle management in relation with weight management and calorie restriction. And this is like once you sort of really get it all together and want to fine tune all the pieces. So I went from a peak of 204 pounds to 142 pounds. That was my lightest.
Skinny.
And I honestly felt pretty good at 142 because you feel so light on your feet. But I had lost basically all my muscle mass during that process. And that's okay. It gave me a base from which to start. So it kind of worked for me. And then since that time, I've put on about 15 pounds, mostly muscle. And now I'm kind of in this sort of fine tuning place where how can I not overeat, not violate the theories of thermodynamics, but also ingest and consume enough protein in order to maintain or even build muscle mass. And this is the sensitive little balance. So, let's say I exercise a lot and I have probably a pretty good basal metabolic rate at this juncture. So I can probably consume 3,000 calories per day and remain relatively neutral. But I don't want to consume all those calories all the time. But if I'm losing weight, I'm also going to be losing muscle mass. Mm-hmm. So of those calories that I do eat, I want to make sure that I'm getting enough protein. Because again, that protein will be broken down, catabolized into core amino acids that my body will use for muscle, but also for transport molecules, for enzymes, for neurotransmitters, insulin itself is a peptide hormone. It's made of amino acids. Sometimes we just think about protein as like, we eat a cow and it goes right to our muscle. But no, it's like we're making hundreds of thousands of proteins in the body all the time. Muscle just happens to be one expression of them. Particularly though, for muscle, you want to make sure that you are eating enough of the kind of what's called the branch chain amino acids, the like leucine, for example. So just briefly on amino acids and protein, there are 20 or 21 amino acids in the body. Your body miraculously, endogenously makes 12 of them. So it develops and generates 12 of them on its own. But there are 9 essential amino acids, essentially the amino acids that you must get from dietary sources. Now, and one of those amino acids that's very responsible for the generation of muscle is leucine. So where are you going to get this protein to knowing that there's a high thermic effect of protein, right? And knowing also that it's about 4 calories per gram, right? And you want to try to get about a gram per pound that you weigh. Now that is very difficult, and a lot of people argue about this all day. You put 0.8 grams per pound, 1.2, I've even heard, like Peter Attia is the 1.2 guy, but let's just say I weigh 158 pounds or something. To get 158 grams of protein per day
crazy.
Is pretty difficult, You can do it if you really want to geek out about it. It is very hard to do by just eating plants. Now, you can do it by just eating plants. And of course, look at all these unbelievable, completely ripped athletes
who are vegan.
Yeah. But they're
eating really carefully
what they're doing. They've got nutritionists and trainers, and they know all of their protein sources that they get within plants. Yeah, sure, pea protein.
Or look at a gorilla who I think is good. The gorilla who is a vegetarian, but they have to spend like 6 to 8 hours of the day eating.
Yeah,
well, isn't part of it just like how much you're actually going to eat if you're going to, of high quality food, if you're going to be a vegetarian.
You have to eat a
animal.
lot as a vegan. You have to eat a lot, tremendous volume of food.
And intention.
And you have to really, really know what you're doing. You got to okay, my quinoa and my mushrooms and my pea protein and my soy. And you've got to just really, really know. It's hard to be a casual vegan and get enough protein to maintain or build muscle mass. So then, okay, your other choices there are, you can eat meat, but certainly there's, salmon and line caught tuna and these kind of fish and the other smash fish, these kind of small oily fishes, are very potent sources of protein. If you want to get into whey, which is curds and whey, so it's comes from the curdling of milk and the creation of cheese, and then the dehydration of that through that process.
The removal of lactose. So
the removal of lactose. Whey protein is very, very effective if you want to consume a lot of protein without also consuming the fat that comes with it that's highly caloric. So this is once you start to get really fine-tuned in this process, in this journey, you start to look at those kinds of things of how can I keep calorie intake at a certain level while maximizing my protein intake. And
it's not expensive. High quality meat sources, fish sources are very expensive, and whey is one of those things that is inexpensive and easily available.
And then of course you have to train. So, you can get all of your requisite protein, but then, you've got to train. You've got to get to the gym or ruck or squat or do your pull-ups or do your push-ups, etc. And so that's when you start to really optimize around this kind of balancing act between weight management and muscle management. I think that's where you go. And then, of course, there's all the drug interventions.
I mean, let's just get really, let's just dial away from your experience, which has been intensive, and you're a citizen scientist who's really gone into this intellectually as well as experientially. But for people who, work 8 to 12 hours a day and don't have the time or necessarily the inclination or the resources to really geek out on this, give the top line of what are the, it's annoying, but what are the 5 things that are pretty easy to do that you can start tomorrow? It's important for it to not feel like you have to become a health hacker in order to avail yourself of these, really dynamic health changes. So give it to me.
A whole foods, high fiber diet that has a low glycemic load. Okay? So whole foods, high fiber, low glycemic load. That's one thing. Sleep is
That's also known as when you go to the grocery store, shop around the outside, right? It's kind of
sure. Yeah.
It's a fairly good one.
Yeah. Don't go in the middle aisles. So that is from a dietary perspective. Sleep. So everyone knows at this juncture, not everyone, but most people know a lot of the sleep protocols, but sleep is absolutely key to insulin sensitivity and energy levels in general. So sleep, we didn't talk about that much. I would say a time-restricted or calorie-restricted focus. So some kind of fasting protocol.
Even if it's 12, or 12. Just so that you're not eating into the midnight hours.
Correct. Try to take your last bite of food 3 hours before you go to sleep and give your body an opportunity to repair and restore. We can't always be in growth mode. We need to also repair and restore. So even if it's 12-12, that's a great place to start. And it's really not that hard. You might not trigger high level autophagy or whatever, but you will, you'll give your body a chance to recover, and you won't be in a constant state of hyperinsulinemia or high insulin levels. I would say take a cold shower before you eat your first bite of food in the morning. Pretty much everyone has the accessibility to cold water. And so while you're in a quasi-fasted state, even if you're not 16-8, just take a cold shower in the morning. There's so many other benefits associated with that, like prolonged dopamine release. It's great for your immune system, but really for your metabolic health, for the reasons that we described, push the edges of your psychological thresholds.
Let me add to that, because I think it's really important for people who are where that sounds like just an awful idea. I can't remember who said this, but it was really helpful for me, because the thought of taking a cold shower first thing in the morning just sounds so bad. But the only way I can do it is to start warm and then dial the temperature down. And somebody said that, and then I get down as cold as I can get, and then I can be in there for a bit of time. But if I just start going in cold, I can't do it. And then if I do that for a few days, then I can start to get in cold. But it's I have to coax myself to cold being not as awful. And then my nervous system is taking a cold shower isn't as bad. But if I just am I'm going to just take a cold shower, I generally won't do it. But that's a kind of a way to sneak your way in. And somebody said that cold isn't, obviously most effective is an ice bath that's down there at, less
Yeah,
a freezing
cold
level,
is
but
completely
cold is
subjective.
Cold is subjective.
Yeah, cold is completely subjective. Some people can get benefits from cold therapy at 60 degrees, and that's not that cold. What's cold is what feels cold to you. And obviously you need to be safe about all of these protocols, but, start with what pushes the edge of your comfort, and then go down and down as you can. Usually you want 4 to 5 sessions per week with a cumulative total of about 12 to 15 minutes of total cold therapy. So, that means 2 minutes in the morning, more or less, every day or every other day or something like that. You don't have to be completely neurotic about it, but that's really where you're going to see the real benefits. And there's obviously a psychological benefit, to this as well. I mean, that's why Navy SEALs train in cold water, et cetera.
It does feel really good after.
Well, it also, it has, as I mentioned, it stimulates a dopamine response up to 48 hours after the session.
Wow.
And it will also increase epinephrine without increasing cortisol. So it is an unbelievable technique. Also, if you want to be focused, if you're about to enter a learning bout, or you need to focus on anything in particular. I mean, we know this just as a product of direct experience. You get in a cold shower, you feel pretty alert. But there's a reason for that, which is that your adrenal glands secrete epinephrine, and you get the jolt of that particular neuromodulator that makes you feel very alert, but without the cortisol. So that's a pretty amazing attribute. So we covered sleep, diet, fasting, cold therapy, and then the last one, it really is resistance training. You need to work your muscles. In fact, what I would suggest is if you have the option between aerobic training or muscle training, opt for muscle training. It's going to be, from a thermodynamics perspective, it's going to burn more calories, but long term, the development of muscle mass has so many beneficial attributes from a metabolic perspective. That being said, ideally you're doing aerobic exercise 4 to 5 times per week. Most of that is zone 2. So you get your heart rate up to about 60 to 70% of capacity. And then
let's just dial. So zone 2 being where you feel like you're working, but you can still hold a conversation.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. So you got your heart rate up to 60 or 70% of capacity. So you do that maybe 3 or 4 times a week. And then twice a week, you do a zone 5 where you're pushing the maximum heart rate. And, you're burning different kinds of fuels during zone 2 versus zone 5. Zone 2 is better for burning fat. Zone 5 is more about burning glucose and glycolysis because of oxygen debt and a whole bunch of other reasons. But the combination seems to be sort of the golden chalice. 3 and 4. So to sum up, stress triggers the release of hormones, including glucocorticoids like cortisol from the adrenal glands. Now, chronic stress can lead to insulin resistance, which can make it very difficult to maintain a healthy weight. Now, protocols like intermittent fasting, stress management, resistance training, and cold water therapy can help. They certainly helped me. So if you enjoyed this show, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss an episode. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to share our content with others who might benefit from this valuable information. Okay, that's all from the Commune for today. My name is Jeff Krasno, and I'm here for you.